Using outside experts. Quite often when we're going to perform an audit, we may not have all of the skills in-house necessary to conduct various parts of the audit. There is quite often organizations suffer from a lack of skilled IT auditors, and very few IT auditors have expertise in all of the areas of an IT system today. Quite often we therefore will need access to specialized expertise. Say for example a person who is able to perform an audit on a specialized piece of equipment, a system that we are not necessarily familiar with. There can also be the requirement to have an auditor who's able to perform some type of forensics. Forensics is the investigation of evidence in relation to, quite often, some type of criminal behavior or a rather serious investigation. This can require a forensics examination of storage media such as a hard drive, a camera, a smartphone, even of course of network forensics, or in some cases even the examination of malware, software forensics. Rarely will we find an organization that has the level of skill in-house to truly perform an appropriate level of forensics audit. And therefore we'll quite often call on people that do have that specialty, should we say, skill, tools, and also of course the reliability. Quite often, if we're going to do some type of penetration test, we're going to do a vulnerability assessment, we're going to examine networks, we'll call on outside experts that have the tools and expertise necessary to be able to try to penetrate firewalls or to examine of course, network configurations and network-based controls. We also could bring in people that have specialty in wireless, being able to examine wireless traffic and of course detect some type of rogue wireless device or some type of potential attack being launched against our wireless communications. Very often an investigation that is dealing with human resources gets into legal issues as well. And this is where quite often we need to bring in somebody who has knowledge of human resources law, corporate law, or other types of, say, intellectual property law that could be necessary in a rather serious audit situation. This, of course, then requires the use of outside experts that will have the ability to augment our audit staff that we have internally. However, when we're going to look at the use of outside experts, we must understand that there are sometimes legal restrictions. Whether or not we are allowed to give people access to our information, access to our systems, whether or not those people must be the citizens of our country, whether or not they must have certain levels of clearance and so on. We should also seek to ensure that we have the provisions within our audit charter that says we are authorized to bring in outside experts to help with the audit itself. We have to understand that outside experts can be expensive. Sometimes they may not be available. There are other risks and liabilities associated with using outside experts that could affect our audit schedule and audit plan, as well as, say for example, an outside expert discovers something on our systems which was actually illegal. Then we have to have very careful provisions in the contract we have with an outside expert of how that situation will be handled. We have to make sure that we are law-abiding, but at the same token, we want to make sure that there are careful provisions to make sure that the interests of our organization and employees are also protected in the case that outside expert comes across something which is illegal and must be reported to law enforcement. There's also the risk, of course, that when an outside expert finds a problem, they now become aware of a vulnerability in our systems, and we want to make sure that they are not going to disclose that or misuse that knowledge now that they have. We want to make sure that when we bring in an outside expert, that they truly are independent and objective. This was a problem especially we saw when many audit firms were also acting as consultants. Therefore, the auditors coming in to perform an audit were not then really willing to point out any problems that could be in the areas where their company had also been doing consulting. They were not truly independent, nor were they objective to be able to then to provide management with the accurate and truthful information that they required. We want to make sure that the outside experts we brought in truly have the knowledge, skills, and ability to do the job properly. They are competent, they truly have the skills and qualifications necessary. In some cases, for example, with a forensics audit, we want to make sure that person has the training and qualifications that if this was to be something that ended up in a legal issue or a more serious investigation, that they were able to then act as an expert witness or as a qualified then assessor or auditor of that area in which they were working. Of course, an outside expert should also be supervised to make sure that they are acting within the bounds and parameters of the contract and that they are then handling the investigation, that they are doing the work they're doing certainly in the proper way. We should also put in the contracts with outside experts how we will then communicate those audit results, the form in which those audit results will be communicated, who they are communicated to, and to make sure that once the audit work is completed, that all of the information they have, they will not retain. That, of course, we don't want information about our vulnerabilities in the hands of a third party that is no longer under contract to us. So these are some of the careful considerations we have to put in place any time we are considering using outside or third party auditors. Other things we'll do before engaging a third party is to do background checks. Does this person have a criminal record? Does this person have then the skills, knowledge, education that they claim to have? And for example, do they have then the certifications that they also may claim to have? We can check the testimonials then of other clients they've had in the past and whether or not they would recommend their work. We make sure that they have the appropriate level of access to systems, buildings, and of course our documents and our records. In many cases, this does require supervision. This also ensures that their level of access should be removed once then the contracted audit work has been completed. We have to make sure we clearly state any restrictions we have on the sharing or disclosure of information. We quite often have to ensure that they are then operating within the rules of engagement. Who can they talk to and what sort of things can they do in the performance of their audit function? We may also put restrictions on the types of tools that can be used. For example, with a penetration test, it could be that tools are used which could potentially damage our systems or networks. We want to make sure that care is taken that they are not going to cause some type of system operation. We want to make sure tools they use are certainly legal and, of course, are being used by people in a competent and, of course, skillful manner. We also will declare the types of methodologies they can use. Going back to the example of a penetration test, if a corporation is going to do a penetration test for us, they quite often will then do a pen test of our web applications, maybe of our network firewalls, but other types of penetration tests could be conducted using physical penetration, trying to break into the building, or doing social engineering. Do we want that? We have to make sure that there are clearly stated rules of engagement of the types of methodologies they can use. For example, doing a penetration test recently, we were restricted that we could not use any type of spoofing email. That was something that the organization did not want to have because they felt it could pose an unacceptable level of risk to the organization. We make sure that before any work commences, we have in place non-disclosure agreements to make sure that the people involved and the corporation involved in performing the tests will not disclose any information to an outside party about the information they have uncovered or any types of problems they found when they performed the penetration test. So these are some of the considerations to make sure that our pen test then and our use of outside experts will not pose an unacceptable risk then to the organization. So, to sum up, make sure that when we use outside experts, we clearly state the objectives of the audit and the scope of the work they are going to do. Document the actual procedures to be used in performance of their work, and make sure we provide regular monitoring and supervision for the outside experts. We will then review the results of the audit and the information they have provided to us, and ensure that any findings they have are agreed to by management. When we use external experts, this can greatly augment and support the audit work we do, and should of course be done in a careful, but also, shall we say, a very thorough and competent manner. Sometimes we'll rely on external reports that also have been provided to us by an external party. If I have, for example, a penetration test that has been done, I can maybe use some of that information in an audit of that area that I'm now going to perform. I have to assess how useful and how appropriate is that report. Is that report truly of the area that I'm examining? Has that report been thorough? And has that report then been generated by a trusted independent party? In some cases, maybe a report may have a certain bias, or it may not be complete. We have to always be somewhat skeptical when we're using a report generated by an external party. We usually say that evidence we have gathered ourselves is far more valuable and trustworthy than evidence that may have been provided by somebody else. We can then use those reports to try to see whether or not they support our audit objectives, and can they minimize maybe the amount of rework that we need to perform.